Hello, and welcome to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to speed our state's transition to a clean energy economy. My name is Jo Olson. I do communications here at Fresh Energy, and I'm here today in a virtual hangout with Michael Noble, our executive director, Justin Fay, our government affairs director, and Ben Passer, our director of energy access and equity. Hello to you all.
Hi there.
Hello.
Thanks for being here. Before we start, I want to tell everyone that I apologize in advance if we have any technical issues, if you hear a dog barking, etc. We may experience these things since we're all recording from different locations at home. Technology aside, in this podcast, we're going to get an update on Fresh Energy's legislative and policy activities amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Just to give our listeners a little background, Fresh Energy moved to a virtual office in early March, and while some of our work has changed in response to the crisis, much of our research and policy development efforts are still aggressively moving forward. The Minnesota legislature is still in session. The Public Utilities Commission meetings have moved to a virtual setting, but they're still happening. And to top it off, the federal government has made a big announcement around rollbacks to the Obama-era Federal Clean Air Act. So I'm hoping what we can have today is just a rolling discussion around how Fresh Energy's legislative and policy goals have changed in response to the crisis. I also want us to take a step back and talk about what COVID-19 will mean for our work around clean energy in Minnesota. Before we dive in, Michael, was there anything that you wanted to add?
Well, just of course, everyone has to focus on their families and their health and folks they care about and love who are out of work. That's first priority, is taking care of each other. But as America and Minnesota looks to get its economy going back in the right direction again, there's no better opportunity than thinking about what is the one biggest thing that can lift up the whole economy and pull us all together, and that's attacking this long-term problem of decarbonizing our economy and having a fair and prosperous world that's not dependent on fossil fuel emissions into the atmosphere.
Thank you, Michael. And now I think, Justin, if you're ready, could you set the scene for us? What's happening with the Minnesota legislative session?
Well, just like, is happening in so many of our lives, the world of the legislature has been turned pretty completely upside down in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, the legislature has a very important role to play in directing resources and responding from a policy perspective to what's happening and making sure that Minnesotans are getting the support they need from their state government. At the same time, the logistics of how the Capitol operates is challenging. Under normal circumstances, it's a confined space. It's designed to maximize direct public involvement, and so the way that decisions get made and how the way that can happen or the ways that typically happens in public have to change. And so a lot of what's happened over the past month has been the legislature prioritizing the most immediate emergency response activities, passing funding for hospitals and first responders and workers' comp for healthcare workers and those on the front lines of the crisis, and policy responses like that. Other items have necessarily had to take a backseat and have been a little bit slower to figure out. And as the legislature has been prioritizing its emergency response, they've also been relearning how to, or I shouldn't even say relearning, learning how to conduct public business in a transparent way when there's little to no ability to have the public physically there while decisions are getting made. And so that's involved a lot of experimentation with technology and just like we're doing today to record this podcast, the legislature has been having committees meet through Zoom and on Facebook Live and on YouTube and other technology platforms. So it's a very different world for those of us that lobbyists and are used to sort of, frankly, purposes of our jobs are to physically be there in the room when decisions are get made. It's a very different environment that we're all operating in. I would say just this week, the legislature has started to entertain some business that is not necessarily only COVID related. And it's been very baby steps. It's a few legislative committees have started to hold more official virtual hearings. And that's just sort of, I would say it's like dipping their toe in the water a little bit. And I think probably a signal of how they're going to try to operate over the last few weeks of the session. We're down to less than 5 weeks before the constitutional deadline for adjournment. And so I think there will be some pressure to get some things done, including beyond kind of pandemic response. And I think we're just getting, for the first time, just in the last few days, have been getting a taste of what that's going to be like.
Thank you for that. We are living in a different world now than we were a few months ago. If folks remember, that's when we recorded our initial kickoff policy-related podcast. Fresh Energy still has a relatively extensive legislative and policy agenda this year, but I want to start our discussion around that, discussing what the new post-COVID policy work is that we've added to the Fresh Energy list. So Justin, do you want to kick us off here?
Sure. So I think, we have a lot of pride at Fresh Energy over the kind of breadth of the clean energy agenda that we bring to the legislature on an annual basis. And obviously that's had to be changed radically in the current environment. And we've had to, frankly, step away from some things that we were excited about and optimistic about for this session. But we've also had to take on some new work in its place. And in this moment in history, we've been really working hard as an organization to determine where are the opportunities where we can have the greatest impact, and what is our obligation at this moment in history as a, frankly, relatively privileged organization working in the clean energy and advocacy space, and where can we make the most difference and help the greatest number of people. For us, what that's really meant is leaning into energy specific, and I will say energy systems, and how they're responding to this kind of unprecedented set of circumstances. And Ben, who's on with us today, has really been providing some critical thought leadership, both for our organization and frankly, for our community of advocates as we think about how to prioritize and what communities of people are being disproportionately impacted in this moment.
Thanks, Justin. I think, as Justin mentioned, our work has really shifted with this core focus around energy access and equity, and really more broadly, equity in the energy system. I think, thinking back to March, when I think a lot of the situation around COVID-19 was really starting to become clear, not just for our country, but for Minnesota and how this situation was going to affect Minnesotans more specifically. We saw utilities really starting to take specific action to protect their customers, and the reasons being folks were facing sudden economic hardship. Were suddenly finding themselves in situations where it was becoming harder to pay, basic expenses, or due to sudden loss of wages, weren't able to keep up with ongoing utility bills, housing expenses, and other essential needs. So we saw these utilities voluntarily taking action to protect customers, agreeing to stop disconnecting customers for non-payment, reconnecting customers who had previously been disconnected, and extending other protections in this unprecedented time. Fresh Energy quickly put together a web page, which is still live, which we've been updating, really tracking these individual utility responses as a resource to Minnesotans as this process was quickly unfolding. However, we also saw an opportunity for broader statewide action. So while we were excited to see utilities voluntarily doing this to benefit their customers, we also want to ensure that all Minnesotans have access to these benefits and to these critical protections in this unprecedented time. So we, while tracking those utility actions, did also craft recommendations to utilities throughout the state, as well as decision makers in Minnesota, around policies that could really help protect customers in a uniform way. That was something that I think we really felt was important in an immediate sense, but also just continuing from our role as an energy policy organization. So knowing that our work had shifted significantly, still leveraging our strengths and our skill sets to think about how the energy system can continue to benefit all Minnesotans during these really trying times. Thinking longer term, we know that this pandemic will end. It's a really trying time for all of us right now, and we don't know how long it will last, but we know it will end. And so thinking to the end of this pandemic, we also recognize that there are under-resourced households, communities of color that have been facing significant hardships before this pandemic started. And so we recognize a need not just to think about the immediate sense of urgency in this crisis, but also thinking about how we can begin to rebuild after this crisis, and really with an eye on equity for those who were already facing significant hardship before this all began. So we have really started thinking about what does that look like for the energy system? What does it look like for housing? What does it look like for transportation? How can we ensure that all customers have access to energy efficiency, renewable energy, clean, safe, reliable transportation, and reliable family supporting careers in the clean energy sector? I think there's a lot of unknowns to that, but we do know that we can't return to business as usual. And we know that there's a significant need for massive scale change in the energy system. I think Michael, importantly highlighted, this is the time to be thinking about those things. This is the time to be, rebuilding our economy with an eye on decarbonizing and on equity. And so, I think there's a lot more that we need to flesh out, but I think this is the time that we really need to be thinking about what that transformation looks like to truly benefit all.
And we've been really fortunate to, we have a great community, both of advocates and engaged stakeholders here in Minnesota that are joining us in this work and this effort, and also in state government and elected and appointed positions. The Citizens Utility Board in particular is a partner that's really been providing a lot of on-the-ground thought leadership on this issue, both through public communications and serving ratepayers directly, but also in advocacy at the Public Utilities Commission, legislature, and elsewhere. And so we really appreciate the opportunity to partner and work closely with them. Representative Jamie Long has been a real champion on these issues, and we continue to work closely with him and well-intentioned and very competent leaders at the Department of Commerce and elsewhere in the Walz administration to explore some of the policy solutions that Ben mentioned.
I also think we've been really fortunate to learn from what other states are doing through the organizations that we're connected with in the Energy Efficiency for All project, our partners at the National Housing Trust and Natural Resources Defense Council, and other state and regional partners that I'm not naming it at this time. But our partners in coalitions regionally and nationally, I think, have been really critical to this work, as well as our local community-based partners, Community Stabilization Project, and Inquilinos Unidos, which is a renters advocate group in Minneapolis as well. And we've been really fortunate, I think, just to learn from our partners at the local, state, regional, and national levels. This is, truly a pressing crisis, and I think having the ability to learn from and leverage so many different skill sets and organizations' expertise has been really helpful for us as we kind of face this crisis in Minnesota.
Thank you. So, Michael, kind of a question for you. Thinking forward, will there be a stimulus and economic response, and will Fresh Energy be engaged in that? What do you foresee as Fresh Energy's role?
You know, this is really highlighting for everybody the importance of the role of government. You know, there's a lot of controversy in politics about what is the proper role of government, but when the economy is flat on its back and 20% of Americans are out of work and businesses are failing left and right, it sort of brings out the consensus view that there's a need for government intervention and government assistance. But what's going to happen, unfortunately, is that state governments are going to be starved for revenues, and state governments have a constitutional obligation to balance their budgets. So there's not going to be a lot of wealth in the state treasury to jumpstart the economy. And I think Fresh Energy is going to have to think about what is its role to pull together with our allies in the labor community and pull together with our allies in the business community and in clean energy and clean tech industries and speak with one voice to our congressional delegation about, you know, the federal government is the last resort when there's a need to stimulate the economy. You know, the joke is in an all-out shooting war, you know, you're all in the foxhole together. There's no atheists in the foxhole. And the other joke is that we're all Keynesians now. We all realize that, you know, there's an important role for the federal treasury. So there's already been, you know, 3 or 4 federal actions to keep America's economy afloat. But I believe there'll be a continuing, sustained public debate about the proper role of public investment. And during the last Great Recession, 2008, you know, people maybe don't know their history, but the America Recovery Act had an incredible amount of innovative and driving investments that really jump-started so many of the clean energy innovations that we all admire now. People might not know it, but the Tesla Corporation, you know, paid back its $500 million loan to the federal government with interest, and now is one of the most valuable car companies in the world. I actually believe it is the most valuable car company in the world right now. So look for Fresh Energy to pivot and partner and be in dialogue with our congressional delegation about what exactly should be part of a federal investment in America's economy. Maybe there'll be some big block grants to states, and we'll be more directly influential at the state legislature if those kinds of funds could be programmed at the state legislature. But our congressional delegation, our 2 United States senators and 8 members of the United States Congress have to be influential voices in how America gets back to work. And, you know, Ben has already said this well, and I want to reiterate is you don't ever want to waste a crisis. And there'll be no better time to ask, like, what kind of world do we want to have? What kind of economy do we want to have? Why would we rebuild the, you know, inequitable, polluting economy that we had when we could build a just and carbon-free world that we need, and we were committed to anyway? So let's not waste a crisis. Let's invest in our future.
I think that's really well put, Michael. And I would just add, you know, thinking about what can we do at the state level here in Minnesota, I think, you know, as you noted, there's a unique set of kind of historically unique set of pressures and constraints on states right now. The state does have some tools still in the toolbox that I know policymakers will be exploring, and that Fresh Energy will certainly be engaging in conversations about. The most obvious one is the bonding bill. Traditionally in Minnesota, every other year is for bonding or capital investment projects. That's obviously potentially more valuable than ever. Thinking about what the economy might look like over the next, you know, year or 2 or 3, and certainly there's an opportunity there when we're making investments in physical infrastructure in the state to really make a significant dent from an energy and emissions standpoint. And so we'll be thinking about how we can layer some of those multiple benefits on in a way that is thoughtful and responsive to what's happening at this moment in history.
Got it. Thank you, Justin. And thank you, Michael and Ben. That was very thorough. Well, I do want to look back at some of the Fresh Energy's work that was happening before the virus, What do our new circumstances mean for the governor's One Minnesota path to clean energy? That path included a 100% by 2050 carbon-free electricity standard, updates to Minnesota's energy conservation program, and a modernized regulatory framework known as Clean Energy First. What's happening there?
Well, this is definitely unfinished business on Fresh Energy's agenda and on Governor Walz's agenda. Fresh Energy was, honored to have me invited to stand shoulder to shoulder at the public podium when the governor rolled out the clean energy, one Minnesota path to clean energy. And all three of the big moving pieces are still in play. 100% carbon-free electric supply by mid-century, completely overhauling and modernizing our long-standing program of how utilities save energy and invest in a optimized, energy-efficient, modern economy. And how do we overhaul or improve basically our very good regulatory regime to make sure it always chooses clean energy when clean energy is available. And none of those bills became law last year, and we're hoping that one or possibly two of those bills could become law this year. But the flagship initiative of a requirement of all of the electricity sold in Minnesota be without emission, that landmark goal, unfortunately, this year passed into law in Virginia, not in Minnesota. So Minnesotans will be doubling down and tripling down with the next legislative session beginning in January of 2021, and that will be the flagship priority for all clean energy organizations and all clean energy small businesses and the governor himself and everybody who aligns with the governor's vision.
It's certainly a lot that is before us in terms of just what the challenge is and what sort of the obligation is on all of us as advocates and stakeholders working on these issues. And I think we're so appreciative to the Walz administration and the governor himself for showing some leadership on these issues and planting a flag that's ambitious and that has sort of called us all to action. I think thinking about kind of how the session has changed and what could still be possible yet in 2020, I think that the energy efficiency portion of the governor's package that Michael referenced is still being actively talked about by legislators and by folks in the administration, and I think would be more, not less timely, given what's happening in the world, and particularly just how uniquely hit the energy efficiency industry has been by this crisis and by the economic downturn and by the inability of folks who deliver efficiency programs to go in and out of houses and apartment buildings and businesses as we're all sheltering in place. So the sort of new tools to do efficiency that the administration has thrown its weight behind and that has had some bipartisan support in both the House and Senate, I think is something that we continue to be optimistic about, alongside things like the bonding bill that we talked about earlier as appropriate ways for policymakers to respond in the short term and keep the ball moving. Definitely want to acknowledge the authors, the legislative leaders for the what we call the ECO Act, which is the energy efficiency portion of the governor's package. That's Representative Zach Stevenson in the House and Senator Jason Rarick in the Senate. Terrific bipartisan set of lead authors from different parts of the state and pretty different perspectives that sort of jointly recognize that the most efficient, cheapest electricity is the electricity we never use. And so that means that we need really robust energy efficiency programs here in Minnesota. And we're excited to work with both the House and Senate and the administration to move that program forward.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add about this before I dive into a few other legislative goals?
Sure. I'll just I think Justin and Michael both really summarized it well. I think part of the reason we remain excited, around the updates to Minnesota's SIP program specifically, as Justin mentioned, I think energy efficiency workforce is a critical issue right now, and I think ensuring that those programs continue to be robust and hopefully even expand down the road will provide significant workforce investment opportunities. Additionally, the bill that's currently before the Minnesota legislature would expand opportunities for under-resourced households to access energy efficiency programs, which I think was already critical and is even more critical now. Providing those potential bill savings to those households that need it the most. And so, we remain excited about those significant benefits, and would just echo Justin's thanks to the fellow advocates and decision makers who are really helping to move that forward.
Great, thank you. So what does our current situation mean for Fresh Energy's other legislative and policy goals? I'm thinking specifically about the Minnesota STEP Code, commercial building efficiency standards, energy efficient nursing homes, and conservation solar.
Oh, I love our bills. I miss them. I miss them so much. As we talked about, the focus and scope of the session has just changed dramatically based on circumstances that are just well beyond our ability to control. And I'm very proud of the package of policies that Fresh Energy brought to the legislature this year. I think there's a lot of good ideas, and frankly, some things that in hindsight, look awfully prescient and would have been nice to have had in law a couple years ago. But logistically, the challenge of even being able to consider and navigate political and stakeholder conversations on complex policies become very difficult. And so we've had to kind of rethink the timeline for advancing some of these goals, thinking about what would it look like to be ready for 2020 special sessions, which seem increasingly likely to happen, or perhaps the 2021 regular session a year from now, as opportunities to move all of those and other items forward that kind of advance Fresh Energy's goal of clean, equitable energy system that works for all Minnesotans. So we're going to keep fighting for all of those things, and we're going to do so in a way that kind of respects where society's priorities need to be right now.
All right, thank you. Anyone else have anything to add? I've got a big question next, so maybe gear up for this one. This year was, and still, most importantly, still is, a really big year for Clean Cars Minnesota. Which, as a reminder for folks listening, Clean Cars Minnesota is the Walz administration's effort to reduce transportation pollution and improve vehicle buying options for Minnesotans. Right now, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is still slated to complete the rulemaking process to adopt the Clean Cars standards this year, although the timeline has been pushed back a bit. So I want to talk about that, but I also want to discuss what the federal attack on the Clean Air Act means for this. The feds announced that the tailpipe emission standards rollbacks are proceeding. What does that mean for clean cars? So, first, how has COVID-19 affected the timing of MPCA's Clean Cars Minnesota rulemaking process? Will it still happen? Can the public still be involved? Where are we with this?
Well, the good news is the Pollution Control Agency has definitively and publicly committed that they're committed to completing the rulemaking process by the end of 2020. That's been the priority and the goal all along, and they're still doing everything that they can to meet that goal and deadline. The timeline for when that process is going to kick back up again, of course, has changed. The projections earlier in the year were that March or April would be the next phase in the rulemaking process that would include some public meetings and a public comment period. This is obviously not the time to do that. So this kind of next phase, which is publication of the draft rule, has been put on hold. and there's not a clear date at this point that's been made public for when the process will resume. But there have been clear public statements by the commissioner, in particular, that the agency is intending to move forward when it's safe and prudent to do so, and certainly will be staying on top of that and engaging, when given the opportunity to do so. Okay,
good. Well, I guess people can stay tuned to our website, fresh-energy.org, for when anything is announced.
That was fresh-energy.org. Did I get that right?
Yes, fresh-energy.org.
Excellent.
Well, some big money is being spent on fighting against clean car standards here in Minnesota, and that's money coming from outside of the state, in spite of this global crisis that everyone is experiencing. Koch brother money is rolling in for negative media placements, auto dealers are up in arms, and so on. Why is clean cars so contentious?
So the oil industry is the driving force behind attacks on clean cars, and the car industry is oil industry's handmaiden. So folks are trying to protect their market share of gas-guzzling auto sales, and the oil industry wants cars to guzzle gas. So not only are Minnesota policymakers under attack from the oil industry for their advancing of clean cars, the federal government is trying to roll back completely the authority of states to take this action. It was just 2 weeks ago that the Trump administration made an all-out assault on the Clean Air Act, basically rolling back the clean cars agreements that were negotiated almost a decade ago between the car industry and the Obama administration. And they want to take away the authority altogether for any states to have a clean car standard. It's hard to imagine that you would cut back on a air pollution regulation in the middle of a public health crisis, but that's exactly what's happened. And in addition to the federal government attacking clean cars, just today the federal government announced it was rolling back mercury and other toxic emission standards on power plants. So what could be more reckless? What could be more unconscionable than making the air more polluted right when it's clear that air pollution is an aggravating factor for the public health crisis we're in the middle of. One last thing to say, we are a strictly nonpartisan organization, but we have to call the balls and strikes as we see them. The Minnesota Senate Republican leadership has kind of aided and abetted the car industry and the oil industry by trying to take away the Pollution Control Agency's authority to enact a clean car standard. It's absolutely explicit in state law that the Pollution Control Agency and Governor Walz have the complete authority to adopt the Minnesota Clean Car Standard. And so an initiative in the state Senate is to repeal that law.
Well, I know we're learning things as we go with the pandemic. One of the things that we're learning is pollution can play a large role in people's susceptibility and reaction to the virus. Ben, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the thought leadership that you've been doing for Fresh Energy in this area?
Absolutely. I think it's important for us to consider the health impacts, not just of air pollution due to increased gasoline-powered vehicles, but also, as you mentioned, Joe, what we've been seeing related to COVID-19. Certainly, I think what we know in terms of the trends are true for both. The elderly, the health vulnerable are very highly at risk here. But we also know, I think in both cases, that communities of color and under-resourced communities are at risk as well. I think there's really important ties to be made, and I'm not sure that they're explicitly being drawn out in a lot of the headlines that we're seeing in the news. For example, with COVID-19, I think most news outlets are saying that African Americans and other communities of color are dying at higher rates due to COVID-19. They might leave it at that. They might, mention some of the comorbidities that are at play, but aren't really addressing some of the additional structures that are forcing that as well. Things like inequitable access to healthcare, disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards due to zoning, redlining, other things like that. And so all of this to say, I think both in the case of clean cars and in what we're seeing due to COVID-19, there's some really disproportionate impacts that are taking place for under-resourced communities and communities of color. And we really need to be able to tie a clear thread through all of this. It's really underscoring the importance of really addressing policy equitably, both in terms of, in the immediate sense, Clean Cars Minnesota, but then how we're really thinking about, talking about, and in the long term addressing this crisis in the COVID-19 pandemic. We can't talk about air pollution. We can't talk about this COVID-19 pandemic and who is being affected without drawing those ties to not just, the kind of secondary impacts due to underlying health issues, things like that, but then the tertiary impacts of, disproportionately placed policies and other systemic inequitable barriers.
Well, thank you. Hopefully people can't hear it, but there appears to be a tornado siren test in my neighborhood right now. So I hope it's not carrying through onto the recording. Okay, that's a lot to digest. But I do want to open it up and ask if there's anything I missed that you guys want to talk about, any closing thoughts that you have for listeners. Justin, we could start with you.
I think it's so important to remember that, things that were important before the pandemic arrived are still important. That values that we had 2 months ago are still values that we need to have today and will have 2 months from now. And that means being really vigilant about, not letting various political actors take advantage of this crisis to accomplish things that they were trying to accomplish, months ago. I think, clean cars tailpipe rollback is a great example of that, where there's so much media and public attention being directed elsewhere that clearly some individuals saw an opportunity to move some things forward when the public wasn't paying attention. And I would just note that a lot of the things that we're talking about, these federal actions that Michael was just highlighting, are not popular. There's a brand new poll that was just released within the last hour by the Union of Concerned Scientists on federal rollbacks, and they found that in a survey of General Motors owners, current vehicle owners of GM vehicles, more than 80% want General Motors to support stronger emission standards at the federal level. That's a big number. There aren't very many things that more than 80% of Americans all agree on these days. And I think it's a signal that the public is on the right side of these issues. The public wants cleaner air and cleaner transportation and lower emissions, and we need to keep fighting for those things and not take our eye off the ball.
I think to add to that, Justin put it well. The bread and butter work that we do, while we certainly want to respect kind of what this crisis requires of us now, the bread and butter work that we do will continue. If there's any kind of comfort in this crisis that we're in right now, it's knowing that the processes that we know, in some sense, will come back. And so that even includes things like Public Utilities Commission dockets and committee hearings at the legislature, for example. So we will, continue working on the things that Fresh Energy is known for. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, we can't return to business as usual. So going forward, I think we'll really balance and work to balance continuing the work that we've been doing around advancing energy efficiency, renewable energy, and all around just a more carbon-free economy. But we also have to think bigger. We really have to think about what this moment requires of us, And as I think we've all acknowledged throughout this conversation, what it looks like to truly transform our economy and truly transform it to one that is carbon-free and equitable.
So I want to chime in that everything that we cared about before this crisis still matters. The biggest question are how deep this uncertainty is, how long this economic downturn lasts, how deep this is. But I think it's very, very possible that it'll be very long and very deep. And so, where you might be seeing oil industry stumble and coal plant retirements accelerate, you're also going to see energy efficiency and renewable energy industries and solar industries struggling too. And there's just going to be a lot of pressure really across the board. So what our pledge to you is that Fresh Energy might be looking for ways to trim the budget, but we're not looking for ways to trim our sales. We're not hunkering down for the long winter. We're actively doing strategic planning and asking ourselves, how can we be more ambitious? How can we be more bold? How can we live up to the expectations of everybody who listens to this podcast to shape and drive energy of future that benefits all? Again, I just can't emphasize enough that when there's a crisis as deep and big as this, something new is going to be born. And we'll be there for you as your voice, helping to shape a future that's prosperous and equitable and, without the carbon dumping in the atmosphere that is compromising our children's future. So thanks everybody for attending with us today, and back to you, Joe, to give the final benediction here.
Well, good timing. The sirens are done. So thank you all for your insight. I really appreciate this conversation. We're not sure when session is going to end this year or what the outcome will be. But to echo what Michael just said, you can bet that the staff at Fresh Energy will be keeping their finger on the pulse of everything clean energy related. And as I mentioned early on in this podcast, the Public Utilities Commission is still meeting virtually, and Fresh Energy's Energy Markets team has been deeply involved in quite a few dockets that will affect clean energy in Minnesota for the next 15 years. So all of that is still happening. I think that will be a great topic for a future podcast. Maybe we'll have Alan and some of his folks on to dig into that, so people can stay tuned. We'll keep these podcasts rolling such as we can. In the meantime, listeners can stay up to date on our work via our blog at fresh-energy.org or follow us on social media. In the meantime, thank you everyone for listening and subscribing to our podcast. You can still support Fresh Energy's work by making a donation today. And I'm going to say it one more time. You can make that donation at fresh-energy.org. There's a button in the upper right corner that says donate. So click right there. Thank you everyone for listening, and have a great morning, afternoon, or evening.